On Friday, after Donald and President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine met in the Oval Office on what will go down in infamy as the worst display of avarice, thuggishness, and self-destructive megalomania in the history of American foreign policy, one of Donald's outbursts stood out to me. Let's take a look.
Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know
bless.
that.
You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on this
position to
question.
dictate that.
That's exactly
Remember
what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're
will-
going to feel very
you will
good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position.
I noticed it at the time, of course, because it was personal to Donald. What I should say is that Zelensky's comment about his feelings was personal in a way different from other things he takes personally. Zelensky said nothing wrong or untoward. He was basically speaking truth. Most Americans cannot imagine, practically no Americans can imagine what Ukraine is going through because we have an entire ocean acting as a buffer between us and the horrific violence being unleashed against Ukraine by Russia. His outburst, though, his reaction didn't surprise me, though, so I didn't think anything more about it until we at Marry Trump Media received this email from a listener a few minutes after I published my post. It said, quote, "I'd like to know Mary's insight into her uncle's exceptional prickliness when he thought Zelensky was telling him he had to feel a certain way. The 'don't tell me how to feel' had a level of intensity that registered on my counselor radar as something not about the now, but about the then. Did his branch of your family come down hard on what, how, and when this or that feeling could be expressed?" First of all, thank you for the email, because it's a great question, and the answer has a lot of explanatory power. And yes, I do think there is something about his reaction that needs to be analyzed and explained, not simply in the context of my family's psychological history, but in regards to the ways in which Donald's multifarious pathologies are having an impact, not simply on his inner workings or on whom he surrounds himself with, but the rest of the country and the world. What I saw in the Oval Office last Friday was the terrified little boy Donald Trump has always been. The mask is slipping. Donald knows it, and he also knows that we can see it. The problem for him remains that he has increasingly less and less control over that. But his meltdown wasn't just about his inability to control his feelings while under stress, which, when he occupies the Oval Office, occurs constantly, because he has no understanding of how to do the job of being president or what the job even is. And he has no knowledge or experience from which to draw. He has become so convinced of his own brilliance and his superiority. Remember, I know more than the generals, that advisors, real advisors, are useless. He knows, we saw this rather, during his first administration. Anybody who dared tell him what he was doing was wrong or who suggested he take a different course did not last. Now nobody even bothers because they're all a bunch of sycophants just looking out for their own welfare. In another example of his inability to exercise impulse control, because that's sort of what this all boils down to in a way, Donald came face to face with the governor of Maine, Janet Mills, during a governor's meeting at the White House.
The NCAA has complied immediately, by the way, that's good. But I understand Maine, is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Well, are you not going to comply with it?
I'm complying with state and federal laws.
Well, we are the federal law. Well, you better do it. You better do it because you're not going to get any federal funding at all if you don't. And by the way, your population, even though it's somewhat liberal, although I did very well there, your population doesn't want men playing in women's sports. So you better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good. I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
So why is this happening? Now, don't get me wrong. This is nothing new. Donald has often, or practically always, bristled when anybody has the audacity to push back at him or to suggest that he is not the one with sole authority over everything, that he is not the one who was always right. But it's getting worse, and it's getting worse in part because he's getting worse. Untreated psychiatric disorders do not get better, and they do not stay the same. They deteriorate, right? Also, he is under more and more stress because of the very situations he himself is creating. On the world stage, he is unraveling, and he knows it, at least in part, which is why having people around him like Musk and Vance only gets him so far. So we have to go back a ways to understand this. And first, just generally speaking, in terms of the developmental psychology of the human child, we have to recognize that if we're lucky, we as infants and toddlers have at least one emotionally available parent who consistently fulfills our needs and responds to our desires for attention. Being held and comforted, right? Like the most basic human things you can do for a child. Having your feelings acknowledged and our moments of upset soothed are all incredibly critical for the development of healthy young children. This kind of attention allows children to explore the world around them without excessive fear or unmanageable anxiety, because they know that they can count on this bedrock support of at least one caregiver, a primary caregiver. So mirroring is a process through which attuned parents reflect, process, and then give back to the baby's own feelings. That's a very crucial part of a young child's development as well, because children can't make sense of their own feelings without somebody else helping them do that. Without mirroring, children are denied crucial information, both about how their minds work and about how to understand the world. Just as a secure attachment to a caregiver can lead to higher levels of emotional intelligence, mirroring, and this is important, is the root of empathy. Mary and Fred, my parents, were problematic parents from the beginning. Whether or not, under different circumstances, my grandmother would have been a different kind of parent, whether she would have been a quote-unquote good enough mother, as D.W. Winnicott would put it, is impossible to say. But whatever the case, she became very ill not long after my uncle Robert, who was the youngest of the 5 children, was born. Rob was about a year and a half younger than Donald. Because after my Aunt Elizabeth was born, and she was 4 years older than Donald, my grandmother had another miscarriage. I think she had already had one a few years earlier, and doctors advised her not to have any more children. Let that sink in. Obviously, those warnings were ignored, likely by my grandfather. And during and after the surgeries that were required after the onset of her illness, about 9 months after Robert was born, which, by the way, almost killed her, her absence, both literal and emotional, created a void in the lives of her children, but especially Donald and Robert, who at 2.5 years old and 9 months old, respectively, were the most vulnerable of her children, especially since there was no one else to fill that void left by my grandmother. It is difficult to describe what a tragedy it was for these two very young boys to have their primary caregiver, no matter how imperfect, how withholding, or how selfish she may have been, be replaced by a sociopath, my grandfather. Every single thing an infant or a toddler does is a kind of attachment behavior. What that means is that infants and toddlers innately seek positive responses from their caregivers. A smile to elicit a smile, tears to elicit soothing behavior. But my grandfather, under even the best of circumstances, would have been annoyed by this kind of seeking behavior. He was busy. He had an empire to build. Given the disappearance of their mother, which they could not possibly have understood, Donald and Robert were likely even needier than they would have been otherwise. The more upset they became, the more impatient and dismissive their father was. People, perhaps especially children, did not dare make demands on him at the best of times, so you can imagine how little use he had for two very young children making demands upon him. The annoyance that was provoked in him by his children's needs set up a very dangerous tension in my grandparents' house. And here's the thing. What could those little kids do differently? They were, after all, engaging in completely natural and developmentally appropriate behaviors that were biologically designed to trigger soothing and comforting responses. Instead, they got Fred's anger or his indifference when they most needed his comfort and love, which of course he was incapable of giving him because, again, he was a sociopath. So for Donald and Robert, being emotionally needy, which is exactly what infants and toddlers should be, became equated with humiliation, despair, and hopelessness. If that sounds bleak, it's because it is. So, we need to look at this in the context of child abuse, which was kind of rampant in my father's family. Child abuse is, in some sense, the experience of either too much or not enough. Donald directly experienced the not enough in the loss of connection to his mother at a crucial developmental stage, which was deeply traumatic for him. Without warning, his needs weren't being met, and his fears and longings went unsoothed. Having been abandoned by his mother, and that's how he would have experienced it, because how would he know otherwise, for at least a year, and having his father fail not only to meet his needs, but to make him feel safe or loved, valued, or mirrored, caused Donald to suffer deprivations that would scar him for life. The personality traits that resulted, displays of narcissism, bullying, grandiosity, eventually made my grandfather take notice of him, but not in a way that ameliorated any of the horror that had come before, because, well, I'll get to that in a second. As Donald grew older, he was also subjected to my grandfather's too muchness at second hand, because he had the great misfortune of witnessing what happened to his older brother, Freddie, who was almost 8 years older, when he was on the receiving end of way too much attention, too much expectation, and most saliently, too much humiliation at the hands of their father, because my dad was the oldest son, the namesake, and the anticipated heir to the family empire. Therefore, he was worth paying attention to. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. My grandfather said repeatedly throughout the course of his children's lifetimes that he wanted his heir to be a killer. His sons needed to be killers. didn't take long for him, and likely my dad, to discover that that person was not going to be my father. He was a kind, generous, sensitive boy who strived mightily and, by the way, was extraordinarily successful in his own right. He is indeed the only, or I should say was, the only self-made person in my family. But because the game was so rigged against him, he could not succeed on my grandfather's terms. Because for Fred, being a killer was also code for being invulnerable, which is one thing Freddie Trump was not. So with the benefit of a 7.5-year age difference, Donald had plenty of time to learn from watching Fred humiliated his older brother and Freddie's resulting shame. The lesson he learned at its simplest was that it was wrong. I mean, just wrong to be anything like Freddie. Fred didn't respect his oldest son, so neither would Donald. Fred thought Freddie was weak, and therefore so did Donald. It would take a long time before the two brothers, in very different ways, came to adapt themselves to the truth of this. But my grandfather did it fairly quickly. It's difficult for any of us to understand what goes on in any family. Families are actually closed systems. But perhaps it's hardest of all for the people in it. You know, I've been asked often, what was it like to grow up in that family? I'm like, I don't know, normal? Just as it is for all of us. We have no frame of reference. How would we know otherwise? Regardless of how a parent treats a child, it's almost impossible for the child to believe that the parents mean them any harm. So it was easier for Freddie to think that his father had his son's best interest at heart and that he, Freddie, was the problem. In other words, protecting his love for his father was more important than protecting himself from his father's abuse, likely because he didn't even understand that that's what was happening to him. Donald would have taken his father's treatment of his older brother at face value. Dad's not trying to hurt Freddie, Donald would have thought. He's only trying to teach us how to be real men, and Freddie's failing. So, abuse can be quiet and insidious just as often, or even more often, perhaps, than it is loud and violent. As far as I know, my grandfather was not a physically violent man, or even a particularly angry one. He didn't have to be. He expected to get what he wanted, and almost always did. From everybody. Sound familiar? It was not my grandfather's inability to fix his oldest son that infuriated him. It was the fact that Freddie simply wasn't what his father wanted him to be. So Fred dismantled his oldest son by devaluing him and degrading every aspect of his personality and his natural abilities until all that was left for Freddie was self-recrimination and a desperate need to please the man who had utterly no use for him. The only reason Donald escaped the same fate is that his personality, such as it became, served his father's purposes. That's what sociopaths do. They co-opt other people and use them towards their own ends, ruthlessly and efficiently, with no tolerance for dissent or resistance at all. So Fred destroyed Donald too, but not like snuffing him out, as he did with Freddie. Instead, he short-circuited Donald's ability to develop, experience the entire spectrum of human emotion. By limiting Donald's access to his own feelings and rendering many of them unacceptable, like seriously, the range of emotions Donald experiences on the continuum of all human emotions is extraordinarily narrow and all negative. Fred perverted his son's perception of the world and damaged his ability to live in it. Donald's capacity to be his own person rather than an extension of his father's ambition, became severely limited. So that is, at least in part, why Donald cannot contain himself when he believes, no matter how erroneously, that somebody is telling him he needs to feel a certain way. Not because my grandfather co-opted his middle son's feelings for his own benefit, which of course he did, but because Donald knew that if he didn't do whatever his father required of him, including feeling a particular way that undoubtedly cost him terribly, he would end up like Freddie, outcast, humiliated, pitied, and eventually dead. But perhaps even worst of all, in my family, he might also end up like Freddie did in this way: poor. Donald Trump deserves absolutely none of our pity, none of our sympathy, none of our empathy. But what happened to those children, and in particular to my Uncle Donald and my father Freddie, is the stuff of Greek tragedy. And we should have some compassion for them, certainly for my dad. This is all going to continue to unravel more quickly and more horribly because Donald knows that having minders or handlers or sycophants circling him isn't going to contain his worsening psychopathologies or his worsening inability to have any kind of impulse control at all. And Donald, it certainly isn't going to protect you from the terrible knowledge you have spent your entire miserable life protecting from yourself and everybody else in the world from knowing. And none of this will end well for you. Please take a second and like and share this video. Be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please follow us and give the show a 5-star rating because it really does help other people find our content. Thanks.